So a brief introduction for those of you who don't know me. I'm Alicia Mackay and I'm all about strategy and change. I'm also a bit of a public sector enthusiast. Yes, we do exist. I started my career in local government as a policy wonk. I've spent a bit of time in the private sector, and I've spent the last 5 or so years working with leaders and with teams who need to be a bit more strategic when they're solving problems, who want to make better decisions, and especially relevant to our session today, who want to move forward with some kind of strategic or organisational change. So it's a hell of a lot of fun and it's super rewarding. These things aren't intuitive skills, I don't think, not because they're especially difficult to understand or even to do, but I think because we don't place as much emphasis on these skills as we do on others. And the tide is shifting around that at the moment, particularly when it comes to change and strategy capability. But we've got a way to go. And while we do, I remain in a job. So that's not bad, is it? How many of you on the webinar today, we'll test out the raising hand feature, how many of you on the webinar work in the public sector? Could you raise your hand if you work for government or council or another public agency? Oh, great. Amazing. That's quite a lot of you. Oh, and some of you that don't as well. Lovely. A few here from the private sector. So the ground that I'm going to cover today around the importance of engaging people in change and how to do that actually relates, I'd say, pretty much equally across commercial and government environments. So mixing things up a bit today, the public sector won't be getting all the attention for a change. So what I'll do today is I'll start with a little story, not about government, actually, for once, but about a part-time job that I had at university. So I think this job is possibly one of the most useful jobs that I've had from the perspective of learning things that have applied right across my life and across my career. And some of the training that I did early on in this job has stuck with me and been really useful throughout my career. I would go as far to say as it may be some of the most professional development, some of the best professional development I've actually done. So the job was as an electronics salesperson at Noel Leeming. Is everybody familiar with Noel Leeming? Raise your hand if you've not. Yeah, that was a test. That was a Simon Says. So I was part-time at university selling electronics at Noel Leeming, and it was a really fun little job where I got to play with lots of gadgets and chat to people all day, so I loved that. And when I first started, we had to do this training curriculum. And so the first step of that curriculum was the completion of a whole suite of little workbooks. So each workbook, and you'd get one at a time, would relate to a specific kind of product type, and you'd learn about all of the different features and options. So you do one for washing machines, another one for computers, another one for TVs, so that you could get up to speed quickly and become a fountain of electronics knowledge. And I loved all these little books. I'd take them home at night and sit down and learn about all the different little features that were available. I took to them with great enthusiasm. And I couldn't wait when I started that job to just get out on the floor and impress people with all of the different gadgets and features and show them all how knowledgeable I was. The funny thing about doing that is that having all that technical knowledge, I would say, had very little impact on my success as a salesperson. I found out why that was once I'd finished with the workbook stage of the curriculum, and I set off to do a few days sales training. Turns out selling people on the features of a product is pretty much useless unless you're able to actually connect with them and understand your customers and what their problems or their needs are, and actually talk about benefits rather than features, which was the standout line from that training. Benefits, not features. So this was a bit of a game changer for me, and it turned my sales game on its head. So once I had this realization and started watching the other salespeople on the floor, it became obvious to me really quickly how much more effective it was to take that approach than it was to just be the technical person. So you might be wondering why I'm talking to you about selling TVs, but bear with me, I'll loop back. Something that the sales trainer said to me on the very first day of my training has always stuck with me, and that's that everyone is a salesperson. Like, everything is sales. Raise your hand if you've heard that before. Yeah. I remember reading Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki when that came out, which I'm not sure has aged particularly well, actually, as a text since the GFC, but nonetheless, I remember he said exactly the same thing. And I think the big lesson from my job at Noel Leeming is that my job wasn't actually about cameras or TVs or washing machines. My job was about people, connecting with what people needed and understanding how to communicate with them effectively. So I'm willing to extend this theory beyond Noel Leeming a bit. I spoke at a conference dinner for a software company on Monday night, and I told a room full of quite tech-focused professionals that their job was all about people too, to varying levels of happiness with that statement. But without knowing the titles of the people on this webinar, I'm pretty confident that all of your jobs are about people as well. So what that means when it comes to thinking about change, I think, is that all change is people change. So regardless of whether you're rolling out digital change or strategy or process change, until the robots do come and take all of our jobs, like we keep being fearmongered into through the media, it's the people that do stuff that need to change the stuff they're doing for our change to actually work and have any impact, yeah? So all change is people change, which means that all of us who are here this afternoon to talk about change actually need to be talking about people. Who agrees with me on this one? I'll raise your hand if you do. Whoa, okay, fantastic. That's enough for me to keep going then. Got a great comment in the chat just now from Chris Wallace that everything is actually marketing as opposed to sales, what people need and want. Yeah, that's another great comment, Chris. I totally agree with that. So one of my favourite non-fiction authors is Dan Pink. He's written a bunch of really cool books, and he goes really deep on a topic and uncovers some really fascinating stuff about the way we think and the way we behave and why we behave the way we do. And he's written a really great book called To Sell is Human, which I'm a big fan of, which does a brilliant job of unpacking some great evidence around that idea that everyone is a salesperson and that everyone would benefit from having a better understanding of how to persuade and convince and influence people. Because I think sales maybe has a bit of a bad rap or maybe feels a bit yuck. But some of the research that Dan Pink's done in this space revealed that on average something a bit like 40% of the average workday is actually spent selling. Isn't that huge? So for some of us, that'll be sales in the traditional sense, products and services and programs. But for the other 8 out of 9, it's actually about selling ourselves or selling ideas. So 40% of the average workday is spent engaged in some kind of sales behaviour. And then there's further evidence to reinforce that actually says that time is also some of the most valuable time that we spend at work in terms of creating an impact or leading to outcomes. Actually, one of the really interesting things about the research in this book, and it's a great read, I highly recommend it, is that you don't necessarily need to be a typical people person to be good at this stuff. So I think the caricature of a salesperson is definitely that very chatty, sort of extroverted person who can sway people to their way of thinking. But the research into Sell is Human suggests that extroverts aren't necessarily more effective salespeople. So more commonly, it's the ambiverts, which was a term I hadn't actually encountered before I read this book. It's the ambiverts are the people who sit kind of in the middle between introvert and extrovert, who tend to get the best results. And the key there is not so much about the influence or the pushing, but actually more about asking good questions and how valuable that is, as opposed to trying to produce the right answers. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this one. I think the trick is in being able to understand where people are coming from, just before we barrel on ahead with trying to convince them why they need to buy our thing, whether that's us or our ideas or our stuff. So if you have a good example of a time when you've been sold to, or maybe sold to badly, because you haven't been asked the right questions, or you haven't had your needs understood before you were offered the solution or the answer, you want to raise your hand and I'll unmute you. It'd be lovely to hear a story. Don't be shy. Oh, no hands going up this afternoon. All right. Obviously, we've got more introverts and ambiverts on the call this afternoon than we do extroverts. We'll come back to that one. Yeah, so thinking about that process, doing things in the right order and actually stepping through that question asking phase before we get on to the selling is really important when it comes to this stuff. So if we try to get to the end before we've moved through that meaning making engagement piece, it's an awful lot harder to get people on your side. So process is a big part of that. And that rushing piece is really telling. There are a couple of other things as well, though, that I think we need to be aware of to do a good job when we're engaging with people for change. And these things are just as relevant on the sales floor at Noel Leeming as they are inside a government agency or a company or any other kind of organisation. So the first one there is style. So raise your hand if you've had a sales experience or a comms experience at work where the style has put you off. Yeah, okay, okay. Yeah, the vast majority of us. So either that's because it might be too pushy, or like me with my workbooks, maybe it's too technical, or maybe it just feels a bit off, like a bit slimy or a bit disingenuous. And so one of the key words around style there is authenticity. And I think that authenticity and plain human language and interactions is so important when it comes to getting people on board. It's actually not that hard. I think that when it comes to communications and change management and that sort of thing, it's become very abstract. So we have a lot of great academic theory around this stuff, and there's a lot of frameworks and models and processes, but I think at the core of it all, we kind of just need to be people and be human. And a big part of that is actually about communicating plainly and openly with people. So there's some really great research out there on plain language and the impact, or the negative impact, that speaking in jargon can have on trust, which is sort of ironic, really, because the reason that we use jargon and buzzwords in the first place is to try and establish credibility or knowledge. But what the research tells us is that if you communicate in plain language, people actually trust you more. So it's something to do with the way that our brains process language. So if you speak in words that people are used to hearing, it engages processing fluency, which means that there's a familiarity that makes it really easy to trust what you're saying. So, I'm not across the exact stats, but it's something around 30 to 40% of the cost of managing business transactions, so just any transactional communication inside an organisation, is spent on problems that arise from poor or misunderstood communication. So getting that language piece right and speaking in a way that people can understand has such a massive impact on whether or not we can get people interested and get them on our side. British Telecom or BT is a really good example of this. When they updated their manuals and their website to plainer English a few years ago, they cut the amount of customer inquiries they had coming in through their live chat and through their call centre by 30%. Huge, huge impact. And I mean, it's just common sense, isn't it? People will listen to people they like, and being authentic and having a really open and honest style is a huge part of that. And I think that when it comes to rolling out change or strategy or new stuff at work, when we want to talk about doing things differently, we're quite often dealing with cynics. So not necessarily negative people, but just really busy, time-pressured, distracted people who've been through all this stuff before, and not necessarily in a situation where it went well either. So having that authentic, honest approach can be a huge driver to overcoming some of that initial cynicism. Does anyone have anything to share on this, a reflection on style? Raise your hand if you'd like to be unmuted. Oh, you are taking a while to warm up. So the next piece, and I've talked about this a little bit already, is process. So has anyone read my blog this morning? Check your hand up if you read my blog this morning. Oh, that's validated. Fantastic. So I talk a bit about the process piece today, and I compared it to dating, right? So at the Magic conference dinner on Monday, I had people in the audience propose marriage to the person that they were sitting next to, which was a hell of a good laugh, actually, but also quite confronting for some people, because it's a bit of a leap, even if you already know someone, to expect to go all the way to total commitment, right? So, I mean, even if it's your mate from work, it's kind of a strange thing to turn to someone and do. And I think that engaging people in change is a little bit the same, because we just kind of can't expect to go straight to total commitment and total participation and buy-in without earning our way along the spectrum a little bit, courting, if you like. And I think it's really easy when we're in a time-pressured environment to rush this bit. It's the bit that gets left off, or we think about it at the last minute, or it's kind of a last-minute agenda item. So it's similar to dating or courting. There's kind of a process to go through here before you get to skip all the way to the end. Although, all that said, I did get an email about half an hour ago from someone on my mailing list to say that her husband proposed on their first date 9 days after they met, and they're still together. So that's quite heartening to know that it does happen. So the pace and the staging of this stuff can definitely vary, and that email is a great example of that. Horses for courses. And I think depending on the context and the subject matter, the people that are involved, your history, how big the change that you're trying to roll out is, all of that stuff will have an impact. I was married with 3 kids by 26 because I lived in Ashburton for a decade. So that's a totally reasonable trajectory in that context. Is that reasonable everywhere? I'm going to say no. But generally we move through the same series of steps for change and engagement as we do for dating. So first you need to attract interest, like be appealing and establish there's something in this worth looking at. So at Noel Leeming, that might have been advertising or visual merchandising, the way the stores are laid out. For dating, that's grooming, and I guess in 2019 probably a Tinder profile. And for engaging stuff, it's actually about attracting interest in a way that says, hey, look at this. Your life might improve if you pay some attention. And getting to that initial stage can actually be one of the toughest bits, I think. So just grabbing people's interest in an environment where there's so much on and everyone's always asking for a piece of your time or a piece of your energy should not be underestimated. So doing something fun or being really appealing to get that initial interest is a really important first step. So, once you have people's attention, you've turned and introduced yourself like they did at the dinner, or you've got your Tinder profile up to date, we need to move that along. So getting to that commitment piece on the spectrum is all about proving the benefits of getting involved. So demonstrating ways that life would be better if you were to stick with this. So I think dating wise, that's probably the honeymoon period of the relationship. So it's where we show the best version of ourselves and hide some of the others. It's the part of the sales conversation at Noel Leeming where we connect with the benefits as opposed to the features of the product. So, you know, capture precious moments with your grandchildren as opposed to really fast shutter speed on the camera. For change, it's about understanding what those key problems are and proving some of the ways that you might be able to tackle those. And I think what's quite interesting, and Dan Pink lays out in To Sell Is Human, is that the more we're actually able to uncover or connect with problems that haven't previously been exposed or acknowledged, the more powerful that commitment piece is. So people don't always know what they need. That's okay. But our ability to connect with that is super important. So I guess for change, that might be about saying, look, this is about saving time or, you know, reducing frustration or providing better service or making your job more enjoyable or whatever that looks like. So you've got some commitment, you're in a relationship, you know, you've proven you're worth paying attention to, you've got a bit of buy-in, they're in. So the next stage on that spectrum is ownership. And when it comes to ownership, your job here, whether you're in a relationship or whether you're leading some change at work, is to deliver. So this is the part of the engagement spectrum where we really come into play because we've got to hold up our end of the bargain. You know, we've sucked them in, we're in an exclusive relationship, the honeymoon period's over, and this is where we need to walk the talk and establish that foundation and be what we promised we were going to be when they signed up. So in a sales conversation, that might be the demo. You know, that's where I've got the camera out and I'm turning it on and I'm hoping like how the thing's going to work rather than saying, oh, it doesn't usually do this. It's actually much easier, which will lose people straight away. In a engagement process, it's that initial rollout point of implementation. So whether that's a trial or whether it's full rollout, it's kind of the make or break moment where people need to see some benefit being realised or some problem being solved. So this is the short-term win piece. And there's a lot that we can build around that when it comes to celebrating short-term wins and showing those milestones and making them really visible that will have a huge impact on whether the rest of it actually works out. Because like it doesn't seem to take long, does it, for people to get totally underwhelmed by a new system or a new process and just write it off. You know, if you go to use it the first couple of times and it's all a bit hard, it's quite easy to just drop it. So having that short-term win approach is really crucial, which makes a lot of sense because if you think about the dating version of the spectrum, people tend to have far more committed relationships than they do marriages. So as you move along, you're either creating momentum or you're actually breaking down as you move along. And being aware of each step and what you need to be doing at each touch point for it to be successful and what part of the process you're in makes a huge difference. So ideal scenario, you've got a bit of commitment, you're all exclusive and all going well, you've got them, they're in. The final stage in that spectrum, I like to call the promotion piece. And so that's the real win. In a relationship, that's a long-term relationship, or if you're into it, it's marriage. You know, get everyone together that you know and visibly represent your commitment. Put something on your finger and wear it every day so people know. At Noel Leeming, that might be either getting a personal referral, so having people tell their friends and family what a great experience they've had, or posting online is the modern version of that for an online review, you know, the TripAdvisor piece. And with selling your ideas or getting people keen on your change programs, I think the real win here is when you hear someone showing or recommending the new thing or the new approach to someone else. So that's when you've reached the point of developing change champions, and that's where the game really starts to change and you get that momentum effect. Actually, with my kids, I think the version of this is when I catch one of the older ones correcting one of the younger ones, like, this is how we do things around here. It's such a good one. All right, I'm going to attempt it again because I think there's so many of you out there with good things to share. Could you raise your hand if you've ever had to rush any part of the comms or engagement process when you're doing change at work? If you've ever been in a situation where you've had to rush this bit. Yep. Okay. What about if you've got a positive or a negative story for us on this? Either pace done well or pace not done so well. Anybody brave enough to share a bit of an anecdote on this one? Yeah, all right. So the last piece of the three things that I think are really critical when it comes to engaging for change is outcomes. So the outcomes piece is all about knowing what it is that you're trying to achieve. So what it will look like if you've done a good job at rolling out change and if people are on board. So it's really hard to know if this stuff has worked if you're not clear when you get going about what a good outcome actually is. And it's also about knowing what's realistic in terms of timing and also of outcomes. So that's why that expectations piece is really important here. So if we go ahead and think about the potential suitors at the conference dinner on Monday night, it's kind of like if the person had not only proposed, but then been really annoyed when the other person wasn't kind of jumping for joy and calling their mum about it. And maybe they are. You know, we've got the chick who emailed me this afternoon with a 9-day engagement, which is amazing. And there was that TV show. Anyone remember Dharma and Greg in the late 90s when they got married after their first date? So, you know, it definitely happens. But that's the thing about having realistic expectations and being really clear about what that spectrum of possibilities can look like. So how far you can expect to go, how fast, and I think probably most critically, how many of your people can get there. It varies. You are unlikely to get everyone. And there's an average pace, but there's also outliers, and people are all different. So not everyone's going to start and finish in the same place. Not everyone you date is marriage material. Not everyone's going to buy the camera. Not everyone's going to become a change champion. No matter how skillfully or carefully or enthusiastically you work through that spectrum or that process. I mean, it's kind of a bit like a job interview, right? No matter how great you are, sometimes it's just not going to happen. You're just not going to get the job. So I think while it's really important that we understand the process bit, keeping our own expectations in check about how into it people are going to be at the end of it all is really useful. And I know that we talk a lot about managing customer expectations and managing internal expectations, but I think sometimes the bit we forget about is managing our own. I think Apple products are a really good example of this. So Apple's got something like 600 million users worldwide, like not products sold, but 600 million people who use an Apple product. But how many of those users are sleeping outside the shop the night before the new iPhone comes out? So they're the first people to get it. Just a few people, right? Versus how many of those people are just using their phones and their watches and their laptops every day and being quite pleased by the whole thing, or mostly ambivalent unless something goes wrong. And then there's those few people that are busy being super intense, loving the brand, sleeping outside the shop. And then actually there's a whole lot of people at the other end of the spectrum which are Apple haters. I asked at the dinner on Monday night, how many people are in the room are Apple haters? And I don't know if it was just a tech conference thing, but the number of hands that went up was quite astonishing. And it's not holding them back, is it? Actually, is there anyone on the webinar this afternoon who's ever slept outside an Apple store for a new product? Go on and raise your hand if you've ever slept outside an Apple shop for the new iPhone. No. What if I'd asked the same question I asked on Monday? Any Apple haters on the call? Oh, wow, that was fast. Okay. So something I see a lot in the public sector, particularly with councils, is I think that we grossly overestimate our own importance to everyone else. So we really matter to our customers and our communities as much as we think we do, unfortunately. And this is the same internally. I think at times we have quite a skewed understanding, maybe, of how much people are looking at us. So when we think about our expectations of how people will feel about our change, we do tend to display a bit of bias around this stuff. We think people will be more interested than they are. We think that it will go a lot better and a lot faster than it probably will, just because our brains are a bit dumb like that. So you've got this research around, 9 out of 10 people thinking that they're above average drivers. The maths just doesn't add up because we've got that optimism bias thing going on. So we can deliver outcomes, and we can do that with people on our side, but that's not to say that we can do it quickly. And it's also not to say that everyone's going to come on the same journey or get to the same point. So I think the trick here is being very clear and deliberate and intentional about the process we need to go through to get there, being super real and authentic and communicating with people as humans, and actually understanding at the very beginning what we're happy to take success-wise and how many people we want to drag along with us, and actually what we're willing to accept opt-out-wise, and know that we're not going to make everyone happy. Have we got any reflections on this part of the engagement process, on that expectations piece, that anyone would like to share? Well, you're all very passive listeners today. Oh, okay, so this wraps up my content for the afternoon, and we've got about 8 minutes left for questions. So if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask, if you've got any new ones, or you want to pop something into the Q&A, this is a really good time to do that, and we can have a bit of a chat about some of the questions you've got about engaging people and change inside your organisations. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to pop those through. Oh, so we've got a great question come through here. Do you see this same model working in a context of organisational restructure, i.e. negative change? Any changes that you would make to the thinking? That's a really great question. And I've got a couple of comments on that, but I'd be quite keen to hear what other people have got to say as well. I think that change is neither positive or negative, depending on how we want to frame it. And that's all about tapping into that people piece, isn't it? So an organisational restructure might be seen as negative by people that are going to lose their jobs totally. But for the rest of the organisation that you're taking on the journey, I would assume that the reason that decision's been made is because there's a whole lot of benefits to doing that, right? So that spectrum and that process should look quite similar. What would be different is actually what the key messages around that look like, how you get people interested in engaging with it. What are the kind of needs that we need to understand, or the kind of benefits that we need to be connecting with to make sure that we're able to take people on that journey. Anyone else have any comments on that, particularly in the context of a restructure? Because I think that's a really good question, given how many of us are actually facing those kind of rolling restructures, particularly inside the public sector. Raise your hand if you've got some reflections on that one. Might go to you there, Chris, and see if we can have a little bit more information on that one, because I think it's a really good discussion. One moment.
Hey, how you going?
Hey, Chris, how you going?
Good, thanks. I just actually did a follow-up statement to support that initial question because
Mm,
I'm in the public sector, and I think often, having been through a few org changes over the time, and sort of in the process of starting into one shortly for my organisation, often the perceived benefits of the change aren't either well communicated, well shared, or even well understood by all parties. You might have
mm,
a group of senior managers who think there's a need for a change, but possibly not taking people on that journey, or their perceived benefits aren't necessarily well tested in terms of what's actually going to be the outcome of the change, if that makes sense.
mm, mm. That's a really good comment. So that clarity piece in the first place is really important before you can even start engaging in
Mm.
that kind of communication, eh?
Yeah. I'm
Yeah.
just halfway through your book at the moment, so I haven't got to the solutions yet. But yeah, a lot of it rings very true in terms of some of the challenges, and I guess that layer of crazy, and sometimes that applies to org change as well, is that it's done for what seem like good reasons, but don't really get to the crux of what the problem is, and so it's
Mm.
almost papering over some fundamental change issues that an org structure isn't going to change that. You're just sort of shuffling the deck chairs.
Yeah, so being really clear about what the change is all about in the first
Mm,
place is a
mm,
really critical first step. And I think it touches on another thing as well around that communications and engagement piece, where I think, particularly because it has become quite academic and quite abstract, we tend to go one of two ways with it. So we either just it gets a bit hard and we totally avoid it, either because, as you're saying, the benefits aren't clear, or because we're actually not totally sure how to go about it, or there's some ambiguity about what the change is going to look like in the end anyway. So we think, oh, we'll just leave it,
mm.
in which case we just lose people entirely because they feel shut out. They're aware something's going on, but they're not part of it. Or the other end of the spectrum is that we totally overcook it. And we've got glossy posters everywhere. We're running staff roadshows. We're using jargon all over the place. And
Mm.
that kind of authentic human piece drops out the middle.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Oh, that was a great discussion. Thanks for that, Chris.
All right.
All right, guys. Well, it's 3:42. So I'm going to wrap up, and I'd like to thank you all so much for coming along this afternoon. I hope it's been a useful session for you. I work with leadership teams on this stuff all the time, and the problems are common across so many different organisations, but the principles seem to be pretty the same. And I think it speaks to that human piece that Dan Pink references in his book, and that I mentioned earlier around that authentic language piece, where actually these are very human problems because they're people that we're talking about. And if all change is people change, then the response is to be people. So being human and creating meaning and having a very intentional and deliberate approach to the way that we do this stuff can make a massive difference to the impact that we're able to have. I mentioned that I spoke on this topic on Monday. I'm also going to be speaking at a Treasury Community of Interest meeting at the end of the month. So if you're in Wellington and you would like to know a bit more about coming along to that, then do let me know. If you'd like to learn a bit more about the kind of work I'm doing in this space, or how I might be able to support you or your team, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Here's an email address that you can use to set up a chat, or if you're in Wellington, you are more than welcome to come along to an information breakfast. So the next breakfast is actually tomorrow morning at Leuven at 7:30 a.m. So if you do think you'd be keen to have a chat over some potato cakes in the morning, then you've probably got, I reckon, about an hour to email through to the info address or to jump onto my website and register for that. But otherwise, please do fire through an email or check me out online or on LinkedIn. Thank you all very much for coming along and for your questions. I see there's some more chats coming through, so I'm looking forward to getting to those. And thanks for your attention. Enjoy the rest of your week. See you later, team.